Noon. This is Liz Reppy from the State Law Library, and I have with me Sarah Larson, who is our outreach librarian. We're going to be kind of tag teaming this presentation today. The two of us are the ones that probably do the most legislative history research here. So feel free to utilize us as a resource after the fact. We're going to give you a lot of information in a really short period of time, and just keep in mind you're not going to be an expert at the end of this presentation if you've never done any legislative history research before. And so what we want to do is really just kind of give you an overview of the process, let you know what resources are out there and what's entailed. Sometimes attorneys, once they find out what's entailed in legislative history research, they just decide that it's not worth the hours that it might take you, and they kind of move on to a different tactic. If you have questions as we're going along, please feel free to use the chat feature. Whichever one is not talking, we will be monitoring the chat, and we'll try to answer your questions as they come up during the presentation. So Sarah's going to start us out. I'll turn it over to her.
All right. So before we dive into the mechanics of legislative history, it's just important to kind of think about why this actually might be useful. And essentially this comes up when there's some ambiguity surrounding the words that are used in a statute. I think pretty much everyone will remember from law school that if the statute is clear, you're just supposed to rely on the words of the statute. But if it's not, then we can look to the legislative intent. So what was going on that necessitated a change in the law or a creation of a new law? What was going on at the time? Was there some particular problem that they were trying to remedy? That sort of thing can be looked at to understand why a particular statute was worded the way it was. So a quick note here about the legislative rules for the Senate and the House. Both the Senate and the House actually have in their rules that the discussions, the resources that we're going to talk about today are not intended to be admissible in a court on the issue of legislative intent. But there is plenty of case law here that will that has basically said the court has overridden those rules, essentially. What we have, I'm not going to read through these quotes, obviously, but for quite a long time, and even to current cases, the courts are going to consider this legislative history information. So that's just something good to keep in mind, and you can check out these cases and these quotes when we send out the slides later today. And so we're getting into the process here, I'll turn it back over to Liz to talk about some of the resources that we will be using when we're talking about legislative history.
Sorry, I was answering a chat there. So when we do legislative history research, you're starting with a Minnesota statute citation almost always. And so we're going to use the Minnesota statute citation to get to the session law, which will bring us to the bill number. The bill number is what unlocks everything else that we are looking for. We will take our bill number to the Senate and the House journals, and we will use what we find out in the journals to access the minutes and the recordings. So when we're doing legislative history research, when we're thinking of primary sources, we are referring to the minutes of legislative committees and then also the recordings of both committee hearings and floor sessions. So these are kind of the two primary things that we're looking for when we're doing this type of research. There are some additional resources out there that are useful that we will cover in the presentation. I'm going to talk about floor logs in a second, bill versions, some session notebooks. Sarah will touch on it towards the end, and then also secondary sources. So if you haven't done legislative history research in Minnesota before, you might not realize that the minutes actually are not super helpful as far as telling you the legislative history intent. They don't tend to be very detailed. What we're usually using the minutes for is to learn when things happened, so that you can go and listen to the recordings or watch the recordings. And so that's kind of the point of the minutes, is to find out when hearings happened or when testimony happened. Sometimes there will be attachments to the minutes, and I'll show you some examples of these later on. We're actually going to walk through two examples, one where everything is online and one where most everything is not online. So I'll show you some examples of what the attachments might look like, but sometimes they can be useful. Articles, letters that people might have written, constituents, that kind of thing. So if you're lucky, you're doing research on a bill that was passed after 2005, 2006, 2007, depending on whether it originated in the House or the Senate, so that you can find your minutes online, rather than having to pay a visit to either the Legislative Reference Library or the Minnesota Historical Society Library. And Sarah sent out a handout to you earlier with links to where all of these resources are, but this just gives you an idea of kind of where things are located as far as the minutes. Moving on to the audio and video, we are very, very lucky that the Legislative Reference Library last year got a grant to put online, to digitize and put online this chunk of material from 91 to 2003. These were, prior to the grant, these were cassette tapes that you had to listen to at either the Legislative Reference Library or the Historical Society. And so all of those cassette tapes have been digitized. This is a hugely great thing for us as researchers to have this material online. And the one thing I want to point out to you is that last bullet on the page is that there are not recordings prior to 91. They have been destroyed, and that was not on accident. But this is something that a lot of times people are really surprised by, that they would have been destroyed. And we will talk about, Sarah will talk about later in the presentation, what do you do if you're trying to research legislative history on a bill that was in that pre-1991 period, and there still are some options out there. So when I talk about them being destroyed, this, and I said this is not a mistake, this was an agreement with the legislature, the Legislative Reference Library, and the Historical Society about how long things were going to be retained. And this is going to change a bit now that we've got now that the Legislative Reference Library put the old cassette tapes on, got them digitized and put them online. They're not going to take them down in accordance with this retention schedule. And so this will build up to be longer than 16 years, but this is the reason that materials do not exist prior to 91. I'm going to just mention a few things about floor logs. These can be helpful when you are listening to debate on the Senate or the House floor, because they show you kind of what happened, which bills were discussed when. And this is useful if there's a whole day of a floor session and you don't want to listen to a whole day's worth. You can kind of fast forward in your recording to about the time when your bill was discussed, and you can see what's online and what's not. But this is an example of one from the Senate, and this was from last year. So the House ones are typed up, but the Senate ones, they still handwrite. But this gives you an idea of what we're talking about. It shows you the date, it tells you what time things happened and what bills were discussed, who introduced them, that kind of thing. So this is very helpful if you had a full day. This, for example, this day started at 1:10 and ended at 9:55. You certainly are not going to want to listen to all day, and so it's very helpful to be able to skip ahead to where your bill was discussed. The other thing that can be really useful to you if you are dealing with, particularly if you're dealing with a bill that is pre-1991, is to look at the versions and to see how the bill has changed. Typically, there will be language changes in the bills, whether it's from how it was originated and it changes in the chamber, or maybe it changes as it transfers between chambers. But seeing the language that was removed or added can be useful in determining intent. And so here's an example. The bill section on top, this was research that I was actually doing a couple of years ago for an older bill. But you can see that in the words "an insurer" were taken out and replaced with "an insurance company or a company providing reinsurance for the coverage." And the word "negligence" was also taken out and replaced by "non-intentional acts." So, depending on what your issue is that you're researching in the bill, this could be useful in determining intent. If the question is whether the legislature meant negligence, you can see that the word negligence was taken out and replaced with something else. So that's just an example of how bill texts might be useful for you. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah. She's going to walk us through the first example.
Okay, so this is an example where it's recent enough that everything is online, and if you're lucky enough to have this, it does make the process a lot simpler. Essentially, you'll be following the same process whether you're doing things online or in print, but it's just going to take a lot less time. So we're going to look at an example from the Criminal Code in the 2010 amendments, and we'll just walk through step by step what you would do. I will say that if anybody's trying to follow along with this example, we are aware that some of the links on the Senate pages are broken or do not appear as they do in this presentation. If you have questions about how to find that, please feel free to contact us. We can help you track down those materials. So our starting point is always going to be a Minnesota statute. You'll have the citation, and the first thing you want to do is look this up on the reviser's website. Hopefully you are all familiar with that wonderful resource that we have here. And you can see that we've got a wealth of information. We'll walk through what some of these tools are that are available here. When you're doing legislative history, the history component at the end of the statute is really important, because this is where it will list all of the different session laws that have changed this section. So for purposes of this example, we have decided to look at the 2010 amendments, but if you weren't sure what year's language you were looking at, there's a couple of different ways to figure out when the change that you're interested in took place. This is going to be, again, a little easier for more recent things. For something that's older than roughly 2000, you may have to just look through the session law to figure that out. But for more recent ones, there's a couple of ways to do this. The first way that is probably the easiest is to check the Minnesota statutes annotated. You can do this in print, or you can do this on Westlaw. If you don't have Westlaw access, we do provide free access here at the State Law Library. And you can see, again, we're just looking at the statutory text here. Where we're going to go to find this information of what the changes actually were, you can go down to the credits, which is the same thing as the history on the reviser's page. And then the history tab up there at the top will unlock some great information for us. So once you're in that, you'll want to go to the editor's and reviser's notes. And when you're on that page, you'll be brought to kind of a list of all of the different changes. So you can see here for the earlier ones in 1989, 1991, there's not a lot of detail. But if we scroll down, they've started adding narrative summaries here. And so for purposes of this example, if we're interested in subdivision 4 of the statute, we can see here under the 2010 legislation that subdivision 4 was added at that time. So we know that we're interested in our 2010 session law. There is a way to do this on the reviser's website if you don't have access to Westlaw. What you can do is go to the statutes new, amended, or repealed. It will appear on that resources box on the right of your page. And you can enter your session number and then choose from the drop-down to search for amendments. This will cover 1994 to present. And so your results will look something like this. You don't necessarily get that nice narrative summary that you might see on Westlaw. But for purposes of this, if you're interested in subdivision 4, it will break it down by subdivision and then will tell you what the action was there. So in this case, subdivision 4 was newly added in 2010. So we know that that's the information that we're interested in for doing this legislative history. If you've never done this before, this information contained in the history or the credits field kind of looks like hieroglyphics. These are citations to session laws. So deciphering this, you're looking at 2010, that was the year, chapter 256, and then section 1. All of these are linked through the reviser's website. They do have a complete archive of all session laws going back to the earliest we have, so you can just click on that, and then you'll be brought to the text of the session law. And so you can see here that we're 2010, chapter 256, and then section 1. And the language that was added there is listed right in section 1. So when you're doing this online, for a more recent example, this history and authors that we have starred over here, this is really, this is how you get to all of the information that you're going to need to figure out what the legislative intent was.
And the bill number.
And the bill number, yes. I forgot to mention that. So you, as was mentioned earlier, you will need the bill number to unlock everything else. That is available here in the session law. I'm not sure if my cursor comes through on the webinar, but
Yeah, it does.
Okay, great. So in this case, it's Senate File 3116. The reason I overlooked that pretty easily is because when you're doing this online, this history and authors is going to take you right to the bill. So it kind of takes that step out for you. And then what you'll get on this bill page here is a wealth of information. What appears here under the actions is going to be a quick summary of what happened and then links to the Senate Journal pages. So those are all digitized for this example. Liz will show you what they look like in print for our other example. And then you can see here the default view, it's going to separate things by actions taken in the Senate and taken in the House. They have helpfully color-coded all of the websites. So anything in blue is going to relate to Senate, and anything in green is going to relate to the House. And so you've got the links to the pages there. That's what those are references to. At the top of this page, there's a lot of other information, and we'll walk through these each individually. What we've got highlighted right now is information about the companion bill. There won't always be a companion bill, but oftentimes there is. Something will be introduced in both houses, and it may or may not be the same text. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, but all of that is linked here directly to that bill and the text of the companion. For the more recent examples, this is where you can also find the bill versions. If you click on the version list, you'll be able to see all of the different iterations that this has taken. And then the current text of the bill will always be the first one linked there. The Senate Counsel and Research Summary, or House Research Summary if it's a bill that originated in the House, this is a little misleading. I think people see the research summary and think, oh, perfect, this is going to be a summary of exactly what I need to know. It's going to talk about why they're doing this. The reality is a little less satisfying than that. Essentially, this is a short summary that's prepared for legislators so they understand what the bill is about at a glance. The example we're working with is a pretty short bill. Some of them can be dozens and dozens of pages long, so the summaries are really helpful for them, but not so helpful for legislative history research. So the journals are online depending on whether you're working with a House or a Senate bill from the mid 90s. So 94 for the House, 96 for the Senate. These are also available in print here at the State Law Library or at the Legislative Reference Library. Um, and the process here you're going to follow is relatively similar to what you would do in print. It's just going to be a lot easier. So what you're looking for is which committee the bill was referred to. And the dates are important as well, because that will help you narrow down what hearings you need to look for and listen to. So for purposes of this example, on March 9th, 2010, this was referred to the Judiciary Committee, and we know that the committee reported back on March 23rd. Just a quick note about the page numbers there. Anytime you see an A after the number, that means the bill was amended, and that's going to be an important thing to look at, so you'll know what the changes were at that stage. So if you click on those journal page links, you'll be brought to a PDF of what the print version looks like. And you'll see here you've got your committee report. These vary in the amount of detail that you might get. Sometimes it will have the entire amended text. Sometimes you'll have line 1 is changed to, this word is changed to a different word. So, but it will provide a little bit of information and again, the dates. You're looking for anytime it's referred to a committee. Sometimes it's just one, sometimes it's many. Once you have seen, if there's multiple amendments, you'll want to look at the language and see if it covers what you're interested in researching. And then you can go to this committee hearings and actions. And this is where some of these links don't necessarily work. Again, you can certainly ask us for help if that's the case. But what you have here is links to the meeting minutes if they're online, and then links to any of the audio for any hearings on this. So we had two committee hearings in the judiciary on this particular bill. And here's an example of the minutes. You can see these are really not terribly detailed, as Liz mentioned earlier. But what they do provide is they'll often give you an idea of what order the bills were introduced. For example, this was about a 3-hour committee hearing. Again, you don't want to necessarily spend your day listening to 3 hours of committee hearings. So these will give you an idea of when your bill approximately was heard. And then you'll get information about who testified. Sometimes there will be additional information, like this is actually quite a lot of information here in these minutes. Sometimes they're a bit more sparse, but you can at least get the names of witnesses, who testified, and things like that, which can be really helpful. And so here's another example of the minutes from from the next day's committee hearing, and you can see we barely have any information here other than the times that things were discussed. Ordinarily, we would play a sample of this audio. We found that it doesn't come through on the webinar, so the link will be in the slides when we send this out, so you can take a listen to it and get a sense of what these committee hearings are like. The bill that we're interested in discussing starts around the 3.5-hour mark, so 3:31:35 is what you'll want to queue up to get a sense of what that audio will provide. Again, you're listening for people that testified. Oftentimes the legislators who introduced the bill will give a quick summary and kind of talk about why they introduced it, which can be very helpful. So I encourage you to listen to that example later. So again, you're listening for the bill sponsor. They'll talk about the why, and then you're listening to any testimony. If there's controversy around this, you may hear from multiple different perspectives about why this language should be added or not, and that can all help clue you in as to what the legislature was really intending to do.
Can I just jump in here
Please.
for a second? Okay, so this is a picture of the old way that you had to do it, when you had to actually go to the Historical Society and listen to the cassette tapes. And this was kind of an interesting day of research. I'd gotten my box of tapes, and I was going through looking for trying to find the portion that I was interested in, and I came upon a discussion about some legislation that was intended to amend basically the peeping Tom, the invasion of privacy statute that we have. And so they started talking about the purpose of the amendment, and they had wanted to change the statute to allow video cameras to be placed into hospital rooms if there was a suspicion of Munchausen by proxy syndrome going on, if they suspected that a parent was potentially doing something to harm their child, and so they wanted this option to be able to put cameras in the room. And it was interesting because there was a legislator that started talking, and he said, I'm not sure what's going on with our slides here,
yeah,
but
sorry
give
about
us a moment. And he started talking, and he said, well, you remember why we drafted this legislation in the first place, the original legislation, not the amendment. It was because of that landlord in Duluth that was putting cameras in the closets and peeping on his tenants. And I mean, that's the kind of thing like you're just not going to probably read about. So sometimes you'll get these little gems as you're listening to the legislators talk. And, and I suspect some of the older recordings, they're a little bit more unguarded than maybe they would be nowadays, that they know that everything is being recorded and it's really easy to get to. But you certainly can learn some very interesting things about the intent of legislation when you listen to them talk about it.
Absolutely. So we mentioned that there were companion bill links here. You'll want to repeat the process with the companion bill. In some instances, there is quite a bit of activity before they decide to go with one version or the other. So you'll want to check that, because it's possible there were other hearings where you can find some additional information. When you're doing this online, all you have to do is click on the HF 3447 here. That link will take you.
It takes you, this is the page, and then this is the link.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. I think we skipped a slide.
It's just, I think the box is messed up.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So it will take you to the bill page for the companion bill. And then really what you'll do is it's set up exactly the same way. You can click on those committee actions and hearings, and you'll be brought to whatever happened in the other chamber on that bill. So in this case, there were actually a couple of hearings in the House as well on this bill. We do have, you'll have the House committee minutes and then the hearings. The way they have their pages set up is a little bit different, but you can get to the same information here. And that brings us to our print example, and I'll turn it back over to Liz.
Okay, so it's wonderful when we have researchers who come in and they're looking to do legislative history research on a bill that was drafted in 2010 or 2015, something like that. But that's not always the case, and so there are resources that are available even though they're not online. And so I'm going to walk through an example that's a little bit older. Some of the early pieces will be exactly the same until we get to the House and Senate journals. So we're going to start out with the statute, jumping down to the history to look at the session law. And so when you click on the session law link, we get here to the session law online. And I think Sarah mentioned that the Legislative Reference Library has digitized all of the old session laws and all of the statutes going back to territorial days. So that's a wonderful resource for us to have in Minnesota. So here again, we can see we've got a Senate bill that we're talking about. The Senate file number is up at the top next to the chapter number for the session law. And we don't have all of the handy-dandy links on the right-hand side that we did before. And so your next step then is to go to the House and Senate journals in print. And I'm not sure where all of you are located, whether you are by a law library, but the state law library has all of the House and Senate journals, as does the Legislative Reference Library. I'm guessing the law schools probably would as well, but I'm not sure that they have them back to the beginning. But this is what we're going to be doing, and I'll walk you through the example. Is basically you're starting in the index volume. This is what the books look like. The green books are for the Senate and the black books are for the House. And each session will have an index. And so that's where you're going to start your research. And there are various, I'm not showing you everything in the index. There are lots of different ways to locate your bill if you don't have a bill number. But we're going to walk through an example where you actually have the bill number. So this is what the index looks like. What we've got on the left-hand side is the bill number. So you can see it says SF and then 2383, the title of the bill. And then these numbers are all of the pages within the journal that where your bill, some kind of action on your bill happened. And so once you have done this several times, you kind of realize which pages you need to look up and which ones you don't. I'll just cover a few of these. First reading and reference is critical because that tells us when it was first heard in the Senate and which committee it was referred to, so that we know the day it went to the committee and which committee. The second reading, typically you can skip that. Other proceedings could be a variety of things, but notice the page number that says 6778A. That tells us there was an amendment made. The third reading is just the third reading and typically isn't that useful unless you're looking for who voted yay or nay, because that will be included. And I'll show you an example. And then I'll show you also an example on return from the House. The approved is when the governor, typically when the governor signs it, and there might be a signing statement on that page if you get lucky. So let me show you an example of what some of these pages look like. So this is the first reading and referral, and this was March 6th, and we can see that it was referred to the Committee on Local and Urban Government. This is the page with the amendment, and so it gives you an idea of what it looks like in the journal. Now, what can be difficult is if you don't have the bill version online, sometimes it's hard to really get the context of what's being changed when you don't have the text of what it said before. But this gives us a really good indication that this was a major change to this bill. It started out being a very specific bill pertaining to the city of Uppsala in Morrison County, and it was changed to a much broader bill to change it to statutory home rule charter city and basically any county instead of specific to Morrison County. So this was a pretty big change to this particular reading. This is what a third reading looks like. You can see there's not a whole lot to it as far as really what you're going to need going forward, but if you're interested in who voted yay and nay, you'll find that typically on the third reading. And then this is what it looks like with your message from the House. Again, not something you probably need to look up, but if you're wondering what that looks like, this is what it looks like. So these are the dates that I wrote down. I wanted to know when did it go to committee and which committee, and it stayed in committee until the 26th. We probably don't need to look past the 20th because we know that it was approved on the 20th. So one of the other things that you'll need to do is to check the index for the companion bill. We had it linked up very nicely online in our previous example, but when it's not online, you have to look it up in the index. And there's a table that shows us the companion numbers. And so I always have kind of a difficult time explaining this page. So Sarah, jump in if you have a better way to explain it. But you're looking for this table.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but there is somebody, I think his name is Mike Cracker.
And so we're starting with Senate File 2383. The companion bill number, which whether you go to the second column or the third column depends on what you're starting with. Because remember that there will be a House File 1 and a Senate File 1. There will be a House File 2383 and there will be a Senate File 2383. And so if you're starting with a Senate file in the first column, then you want to go to the second column to look at the House companion bill. But if you're starting in the first column with the House bill, then you need to jump to the third column to see the Senate companion. I'm hoping that that makes sense to folks. It looks like there's some background noise. Can you mute everybody, Sarah, please?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So we've got our minutes and, we've got our dates. And so this is our next step, is to look for the meeting minutes. And for these older bills, they're not going to be online. And so we'll have to look them up in paper. And this gives you an idea of what's online and what's not and where it's located. The Historical Society Library is in the basement of the History Center. If you've ever visited the History Center, the library is in the lower level. And the Legislative Reference Library is inside the State Office building. So all of these buildings are our building and the other two are all on the Capitol complex. Now, we used to have to go to the Historical Society to get to this information that's on the screen now, where basically this was our finding aid. This was the document that connected us to the tapes and the minutes. And so just, I would say, maybe 4 months ago, this was put online. So this is a fantastic. It's one more step that's online. And I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So this is the actual page that relates to our research. You are looking for first the year of your legislation and then the committee. And you hope that the time that your bill was in committee doesn't span 2 locations, because if it does, then that means you get 2 boxes of material to look at instead of 1. What you want to do at this point is to write down that location number, because you're going to need that at the Historical Society. So if you need to go to the Historical Society, you want to make sure to check your hours. I actually made the rookie mistake of showing up, I think, on a Monday, not realizing that they're closed on Monday and that they're late. They're open late one day of the week until Tuesday. I think Tuesday they're open until 7 or 8?
8 p.m.
8 p.m. And just keep in mind that this is not like another library. This is a closed stacks library for the most part. And so everything that you're looking for has to be retrieved. So it's going to take some time, depending on how busy it is. Just know that you're going to have to wait for materials to be retrieved for you. So you want to make sure to bring your dates, bring your ID, because you do have to register before you get into the library. And you can only bring in pencil and paper. They won't let you bring in pens, markers, bags, coats. There are lockers there for you to put those materials in. You put in your quarter and then you get it back when you leave. And there's not a self-serve copier. And so what I do is just take pictures of what I want, when I'm going there to do research. But just keep that in mind. It's one more thing that's different from a regular library that you might be used to. So this is a map of the Capitol complex. The Historical Society is down at the bottom. The Capitol is kind of in the top middle, give you an idea of where everything is located. So when I go over there, I try to plan my visit around lunch. And if any of you have dined on the Capitol complex, you might not know that the Historical Society library is actually a D'Amico cafeteria. So it's good, and it's totally different food from all of the other cafeterias on the Capitol complex. So, if you're going to be there a while, it's a good place to stop and grab a bite to eat if you are there at that particular time. So this is what the reading room looks like if you've never been there before. There are all of these tables. You might be able to see that the tables have numbers on them, and I'll explain that in a second. So this is kind of the view when you walk in on the left-hand side. This is a view from the other end. So the entrance is kind of behind that pole. There's a reference desk. They typically have 2 librarians scheduled at a time. The librarians are super helpful there. So never feel shy about asking a question because they're very knowledgeable about this type of research, and they're very helpful. So when you get there, you're going to need to fill out a slip that looks like this. So you're going to put your name, you're going to put your table number, and the location number. So remember a few slides ago I had indicated that you needed to write down that location number. That is where you fill this in, is on here. And what happens when you fill out this slip and you take it up to the counter is the person working at the counter faxes this slip to the guy in the basement who drives the forklift. And he takes it off of the fax machine, and he gets on his forklift and he drives over to the box that has your location number on it. And if you can picture this huge room that's probably 2 stories high, filled with shelf after shelf after shelf, with box after box after box. So that's what is happening when you are turning in the slip. And so he gets your box off of the shelf, drives it back on his forklift to the dumbwaiter, and then puts it on the dumbwaiter, and it gets brought up then to the main level where you're located at. And then the worker puts it on a cart and wheels it over to your table. So that's kind of, when I said it takes a while, it can take a while. So you open up your box, and this is what you see. There are a whole bunch of files that are dated. And this is why the dates are critical, because you need to be able to look through, you don't want to look through more dates than you need to. And so you're going to pull out each sheaf of papers for when your bill was in committee, and you're going to page through them, because remember, there are other bills being discussed on these days as well. And so you're paging through, looking for your bill number to get the minutes that will tell you when your bill was discussed in committee or, in committee. So you pull out the papers. This is what the minutes look like in paper. Sarah had showed us an example online, but they look essentially the same. But this just gives us an idea of which bills were being discussed and at what times. And this is an example of an attachment to the minutes. When I was going through that stack of papers, I came upon a bunch of letters related to a different bill, not one that I was researching, but this was a bill that was dealing with how county recorders were going to be selected. And so there were lots and lots of letters from various county recorders all over the state with their positions on this particular legislation. So this could have been very helpful for the legislators to get a feel for how many county recorders were in favor of it, how many were opposed. So this is the kind of thing that you might find in the minutes. So we're going to just talk briefly about the going to the Legislative Reference Library. It's more like kind of a standard library, and so you don't have to do any of the other things that we talked about with the History Center. But if your minutes happen to be located at the Legislative Reference Library, that's where you're going to head instead of the Historical Society. And so we can see on the map that the Legislative Reference Library, which we call LRL, is in the State Office Building, which is just to the west of the Capitol. And this is their back room that has all of their binders in it. So what you're going to do is tell the person at the desk that you need the binders for such and such a committee for whatever year it is that you are that your bill was introduced in. And essentially it's the same process as what we saw going through the sheaf of papers at the Historical Society, is that you're just paging through looking for your bill number. So that's kind of the extent of the process of going through the legislative history research. I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah to talk about what happens if the law is pre-1991 and there just aren't any recordings out there.
Okay, so all hope is not lost if it is a pre-1991 thing. Again, there might be attachments to the minutes that you can look at, but there are also a bunch of other secondary sources that can shed some light on the legislative intent for this. So we'll just go through a number of examples here. Old CLEs, we do keep all of the old Minnesota CLEs here, particularly if it's something, a big change in the law. There might be a CLE on it to educate attorneys about what the changes are, what they're going to mean for their practice, and those can provide a wealth of information. Newspaper coverage is also a wonderful resource. Oftentimes when you're going through and figuring out who introduced something, they'll have spoken to the media. I mean, if anybody follows Star Tribune or NPR or anything like that, you know that they do talk about what's going on at the legislature quite a bit. You can access these newspapers in a variety of different locations. So eLibrary Minnesota, which you do have a link to on the handout, provides coverage of the Star Tribune from 1986 to present. The Historical Society has a digital newspaper collection. Depending on the publication, the dates range from 1849 to the present day. This is where you can also find newspapers for various communities around Minnesota. So if there is legislation that was maybe affecting a certain part of the state, you could look at the local paper there. And then the Historical Minneapolis Tribune is also included in that newspaper collection. Only through 1922 is available online due to copyright restrictions. Beyond that, Law Review and bar journals are another great source. If you think about when you're looking at Bench and Bar or Minnesota Lawyer, they're going to be discussing the changes in the law pretty frequently. And again, you can find these in a variety of different places. Westlaw is a resource, although it's not comprehensive for all law reviews or bar journals and all dates. The Minnesota Legal Periodical Index is something that we have been involved in indexing since 1984. We do have access to all the publications included in there, so you can access those articles here. Google Scholar actually indexes some Hein Online content, and Hein has a very large library of law reviews and bar journals. We also, if you're located in the Twin Cities, we do have access to Hein Online here in the library. Some additional resources, these are more specific to the legislature. So there are a handful of publications, Session Daily, Session Weekly, and Senate Briefly, that all provide similar sorts of information. There are different date ranges here, so unfortunately Session Weekly and Senate Briefly are no longer being updated. But what these do are summarize what's going on in a particular committee, its discussions at that time, what floor actions have been taking place. There may be schedules included. So that can give quite a bit of information about what was going on at the time at the legislature. And we'll show a couple of examples of what that information might look like. Another wonderful resource that we recently learned about are the session notebooks at the Legislative Reference Library. Essentially what they've done is compiled for each session news clippings, articles, interviews, all that kind of stuff about a particular session. So there's one for, I can't remember how far back they go.
They go back pretty far.
Yeah, it goes back pretty far. The amount of information is going to vary a bit by session, but you can usually find quite a bit of information. And then there's also online the legislative time capsule, which goes back to the territorial legislature. And we'll show you what that looks like here. So essentially this will give you the dates that the session was convened. It will talk about any particular issues, especially for special sessions. This will tell you what the session was called for. And then you'll have links to the bills introduced and additional information about that all in one place. So that can be helpful as well. So this is kind of an example of the schedules you might see in those session daily, session weekly, and Senate briefly publications. It will just kind of show you a listing of the bills and which committees were hearing those on that particular date. If you are not able to get to the Historical Society or LRL to go through the minutes, this can be a way to figure out what date a hearing was on, so you can then find the audio online. You'll also find in these publications bill summaries here. So this is just an example of one of the bill summaries, and I don't know if you want to give any more background about this one or...
This one I just happened to notice because I drive through this town of Hampton every day on my way to work, and basically it just gives the backstory of how the stopping for a bus with the lights flashing, how the law was changed and why the law was changed. This mom saw a car kind of drive by the bus that had its lights on, and happened to get the license plate number, called it into the police. And the police said, well, there's nothing we can do about it because the way the law is written now, we need to witness this happening. And so, this was kind of the reasoning behind why the law changed, so that no longer does a police officer have to witness this offense happening. And so this is a nice little background story of why the law was changed.
Great. So looking at the session notebooks here, this is what they look like. There are a bunch of them. You can see for the 1971 session that we have pictured here, there are at least 22 volumes. Some of them do not have quite that many. But again, you'll find previews and summaries about the session and news clippings about notable bills that were heard during the session. And so here's just a few examples of this. You may see a review of session laws depending on the session. It looks like we've got all of our special sessions and regular sessions here. And again, you may get a nice index here or table of contents here that will direct you to various subjects. So here's a close-up of that, so you can see, if you're interested in health insurance, you can go directly to that section. You'll also have newspaper clippings here, typically from the Star Tribune and Pioneer Press. But you'll notice here, and we'll zoom in a little bit on the corner, the LRL subscribes to a number of different periodicals, so it's possible that they will have clippings from other resources that you may not necessarily have access to. So that's good to just keep in mind, that you may find more than just the newspapers here. All right, and I will turn it back over to Liz to wrap it up.
Okay, so I'm just going to finish talking about effective dates, because this is something that almost always will come up when you're doing legislative history research, is trying to determine when the law that you're researching actually became effective. And so the general rule is that laws take effect on August 1st after final enactment, unless something different is specified. And so I'll give you, and this is just from statute, so this is very easy to find. This is in section 64502. This is an example of a session law that gives us a different effective date for some of the sections in the session law. And so it's always crucial that you look to see in the session law if it has an effective date listed that's different from August 1st. So the other thing that sometimes comes up is, what does it mean? What does final enactment mean? So again, we turn back to the statutes. Typically, final enactment means when it's signed by the governor, and it's the date and the time that the governor signed the bill. There are a couple of other options that might happen. If there's a pocket veto, that the law went into effect without the signature of the governor, or if the governor vetoed the bill and the veto was overridden by the legislature. And so we've got all of that covered in the statutes. So that is a lot of information to give you in an hour, as I said at the beginning, or almost an hour. You know, this is really intended just to give you an idea of what resources are out there. If any of you have done federal legislative history research, this is very different. The resources are different, the access is different, and so I encourage you, in the handout that Sarah sent out, there's contact information for us, for the Historical Society librarians, and the Legislative Reference Library librarians. And so please feel free to ask for help. It would be kind of a rare situation that somebody who's never done this kind of research could sit through this presentation and then just knock it out of the park. You know, if it's been a while since I've gotten the questions, sometimes I still have to look things up, even though this is part of my job. So please feel free to ask for help if you are doing research like this and you get stuck. Sarah will send out the presentation. You have the handout. And so thank you for your time today.
I think we have a couple of minutes left if anybody has any questions.
You can type it into the chat. Otherwise, we'll close out. I haven't seen any questions other than the not doing the dishes. So.
Oh.
Okay. Well, seeing no questions. And again, if you have questions, you can certainly contact us after the fact. But
Absolutely.
Thank you for your time, and we'll close it out here.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay.